Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your Duke of Dope Discourse, your sommelier of sci-fi, your viceroy of verisimilitude, your existential Mr. Rogers, Robert Meyer Burnett, and I am once again here with an episode of Robservations, the show about something. And yes, the dogs are here with me today, including, well, Gilbert's here. And you all know, because people, see, there he is, ladies and gentlemen, jumping into frame. Hang on, Gilbert. If you're going to get into frame like that, people want to see you. Right, buddy? Sure they do. Here you go, buddy. I know you want a cookie. So you don't bark like Tallulah does. You're a good boy. I know. Wait, no. Don't pull out. No, don't pull out the, no wire pulling out for you. That's it. There you go. Good boy, buddy. Good boy, yeah. 2 and done. That's good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is Robservations, episode number 345. Robservations, the show about something coming to you, you imagination connoisseurs, you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity. And by the way, fair warning, I expect Tallulah to show up here at any moment, barking her fool head off as she does. But the dogs have been pretty sedate, but Tallulah's never sedate. She's half Irish setter, which means she's insane. But that's okay. What can you do? Great to be back. I'm sorry I wasn't here yesterday. I was at a memorial service, actually, for a very great man, a doctor named Bernard Brandstater. I can't even get into his amazing accomplishments, but he passed away at 91. He was Elizabeth's uncle. Step-uncle, but uncle. An amazing, amazing guy. I shall miss him. I'm happy that I did get to know him. But he's an amazing, amazing guy. As many people know, I wanted to start out by saying a shout out, well, Katherine Johnson, who was one of the 3 women detailed, her life was detailed, her time with NASA was detailed in the movie Hidden Figures, has passed away. And I just wanted to read a little bit about her. Katherine Johnson, one of the history-making, barrier-breaking NASA mathematicians depicted in Hidden Figures, died Monday, the administrator of NASA said. She was 101. For those of you who have not seen Hidden Figures, it's about 3 black women who broke through so many different barriers to work at NASA, and Katherine Johnson helped our nation enlarge the frontiers of space, even as she made huge strides that also opened the doors for women and people of color in the universal human quest to explore space. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said in a statement. In a tweet, he called Johnson an American hero. Johnson was portrayed by Taraji P. Henson in the Oscar-nominated 2006 film about the trailblazing black woman women whose work at NASA was integral during the space race. The film also stars the great Octavia Spencer as the mathematician Dorothy Vaughan and Janelle Monáe as the engineer Mary Jackson. The work of the women altered the country's history, but their names were largely unknown until the movie received acclaim. Jackson died in 2005, and Vaughn died in 2008. Johnson began working at NASA's predecessor, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, in 1953 at the Langley Laboratory in Virginia. She said her greatest contribution to space exploration was making the calculations that helped sink Project Apollo's lunar lander with the Moon Orbiting Command and Service Module. In other words, helping to put men on the moon in 1969. She was also the first woman in the Flight Research Division to receive credit as an author of a research report for her work with Ted Skopinski on detailing the equations describing an orbital spaceflight. She did trajectory analysis for Alan Shepard's 1961 mission Freedom 7, which was America's first human spaceflight. She was also known for work that greatly contributed to the first American orbital spaceflight piloted by John Glenn. The 1962 flight required the construction of a worldwide communications network linking tracking stations around the world to computers in Washington, D.C., Cape Canaveral, and Bermuda. But astronauts weren't keen on putting their lives in the care of electronic calculating machines, which were prone to hiccups and blackouts, according to NASA. So Glenn asked engineers to get the girl, referring to Johnson, to run the computer equations by hand. If she says they're good, Johnson remembered John Glenn saying, "Then I'm ready to go." Glenn's flight was a success, and marked a turning point in the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union in space. She also worked on both the Space Shuttle and Earth Resources satellite programs, in addition to authoring or co-authoring 26 research reports. Johnson worked for NASA for more than 3 decades, retiring in 1986. "I loved going to work every single day," Johnson said at the time. She was born in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia in 1918 and skipped several grades due to her intense curiosity and brilliance with numbers. Her NASA profile says, at 13, she was attending the high school located on the campus of the historically black West Virginia State College and enrolled there for undergraduate studies at 18. It was at West Virginia State that she found a mentor in Professor W. Schiffelin Clater, the first African-American to publish a mathematical research journal and the third African-American to earn a doctorate in mathematics. After graduating in 1937 with the highest honors and degrees in mathematics and French, Johnson began teaching at a black public school in Virginia. She also made history before her NASA career when she and 2 men became the first 3 black students to be offered admission to West Virginia University after the state quietly integrated its grad schools in 1939, according to NASA. Johnson enrolled in the graduate math program but left school after the first season to start a family with her husband, James Goebel. The couple had 3 daughters, and she returned to teaching when they grew older. In 1952, a relative told her about the position at the all-black West Area Computing Section at the NACA. She and Goebel moved their family to Newport News, Virginia, to pursue the position. Johnson was placed on a temporary project, but her role quickly became permanent. Goebel died of cancer in 1956. Johnson married Lieutenant Colonel James Johnson in 1959. President Barack Obama awarded Johnson the Presidential Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian honor, in 2015. West Virginia State University has commemorated Johnson's accomplishments with a bronze statue on campus and a scholarship in her name. And last July, when Johnson was 100, a ribbon-cutting ceremony was held when a NASA facility in West Virginia was reintroduced as the Katherine Johnson Independent Verification and Validation Facility. What a great legacy for Katherine Johnson. And, I mean, I'm sorry she's gone, but if she had to go, I suppose during Black History Month was maybe the best time, because she'll even get more notoriety than she already has. And people like her, what they've contributed, not just to space research and space flight and American history, but, I mean, they've really advanced all mankind. And I love Hidden Figures. It was something I really didn't know much about, and I'm a space freak. I love real space. I love the space programs of all the countries around the world now, and I've always loved the space program ever since I was a little kid, and it was great to learn about this story, and I am sorry to hear that she has passed. But at 101, I mean, how many people could hope to live the life she led? So 3 daughters and an incredible legacy. Just thought it was important that we remember her. And if you haven't seen Hidden Figures, it's a terrific film. Now, I know the music. People say, oh, the music's a little contemporary. I love Hidden Figures. I own Hidden Figures. If you haven't seen it, do yourself a favor and check it out. Now, I want to begin today's chat with a letter. With a letter from Miss. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you know what I'm going to say. You know her. You love her. But I wanted to talk today, first and foremost, about verisimilitude. Go figure. And world building. And heck, who sent me a letter but Miss Willow Yang, which you can also go to the Burnettwork.net website and read this letter later. But I've been watching Voyager episodes. I just watched an episode I actually quite enjoyed called Dragon's Teeth, that is very interesting because they introduce an alien race called the Vadwar that we don't really see again, but fascinating. Anyway, this letter is about Voyager. Oh, hi, Rob. Because Joseph wouldn't stop calling me betrayer in the chat for not watching the long list of Star Trek Voyager episodes he had compiled for me a while back, I'm sending over my thoughts on the series pilot, Caretaker. I'll say right off the bat, and even Joseph concurs with this, I don't think this was a particularly good episode. It was entertaining, and it was certainly important in setting up the entire premise of the series, but there were just a lot of problems with the story that are a bit difficult for me to ignore. I'll start out with a small gripe I had, and this is a pet peeve of mine with a lot of science fiction involving extraterrestrials. With the exception of the caretaker himself, all the new species of aliens in the Delta Quadrant, the Ocampa, the Kazon, and whatever Neelix is, were humanoid. Okay, Star Trek The Next Generation did attempt to explain this with The Chase, which stated that an ancient humanoid race seeded various planets with their DNA. I'm not going to go into all the scientific issues with the latter episode, other than just to say that's not how DNA works. How much of the galaxy do they seed? Is the entire Milky Way populated with humanoids? Yes. Yes, it is. Of course, I understand from a practical point of view, it's probably difficult to depict more outlandish types of aliens on screen, but as a viewer who wants to see the diversity of adaptations that life has evolved across the galaxy, that's just depressing. Well, and Willow is bringing up a point here that I wanted to get into about world building and verisimilitude. Relating to this issue is the entire plan of the eponymous character, the caretaker, of wanting to procreate so that he can have replacements. I'm not going to go into the incredible creepiness of him kidnapping people and trying to reproduce with them against their will and often killing them in the process. That is honestly a horror film a la Alien, but from a strictly practical perspective, if the caretaker had come from another galaxy, why would any species in the Milky Way even be remotely genetically similar to whatever he is? His race was so technologically advanced that they're capable of intergalactic travel and transporting people to the other side of the galaxy. Surely they've got some alternative methods for reproduction. Moreover, why did he pick Kim as one of his candidates? B'Elanna is part Klingon, so her genetic makeup would be a little different. But isn't Kim just another regular human? What made him stand out from all the other human crew that the caretaker had been testing? And granted, I don't know anything about the caretaker species and what sort of life cycles they have, but shouldn't he have tried procreating a little sooner so that maybe he could teach his offspring what to do and how to manage the array before he dies? Maybe he should have planned a few hundred years ahead and not procrastinated until the last couple of months. Finally, and most obvious of all, did it ever occur to the caretaker just to transport the Ocampa to another planet? Wouldn't that be a far more practical solution than putting them all underground and infantilizing their race? They could have at least tried coming up with some half-baked excuse for why the Ocampa had to remain on their home planet, but since they never did, I'm just left shaking my head. As for the crew, I haven't really spent enough time with them to be able to form much of a connection. I will say that, having already seen Year of Hell, I do quite like the dynamic between the main cast. While I enjoyed Kate Mulgrew's Janeway in Year of Hell, she didn't really leave much of an impression on me in Caretaker. I think that the character probably just needed more time to properly develop. I was intrigued by the reveal that the Doctor was actually some kind of emergency hologram, that the ship had to replace the original Doctor, who was apparently killed during the transportation. If they have a hologram Doctor, do they have backup programs for the other major crew members on board the ship? And apparently, Chakotay and B'Elanna were part of the rogue Maquis, who had to join forces with Janeway and her crew in order to survive their new ordeal. While I do like seeing former enemies having to come together in a time of crisis, I do feel that the union between the two ships was quite rushed. I would have liked a scene at the end where everyone convened and discussed the state of their affairs, and worked out what they should do going forward. I also felt that Janeway really didn't seem to be at all shaken by the deaths of so many of her crew members. On one hand, she went out of her way to rescue Kim, indicating that she really cared about her crew. On the other, she didn't waste any time addressing the loss of half of her bridge, including her original first officer. It just felt a bit strange. The character that really stood out to me in Caretaker, even more so than Janeway, was Robert Duncan McNeil's Perils, whom I've just realized played Nick Locarno in Star Trek The Next Generation's The First Duty. They're basically supposed to be the same character, but they didn't want to pay the residuals. He's pretty colorful, to say the least, with an apparently checkered past and a strong animosity towards Chakotay. It's a little ironic, reflecting back on Year of Hell now, that the two of them just happened to get kidnapped together by Anoraks. I'm sure that he's going to go through a character development and become a much more mature and stalwart officer later in the series, but right now, he's a bit of an arrogant prick. There was one moment that caused me to raise my eyebrows a bit, and that was when Paris was helping Chakotay escape from the underground complex, during which he teases him about his Native American beliefs, saying, "Isn't there some Indian trick where you can turn yourself into a bird and fly us out of here?" I thought the joke might be a little out of place. Is that something someone from the 24th century Star Trek universe would say? The humans appear to be pretty much colorblind when it comes to each other. I don't think that anyone has ever really pointed out another person's ethnicity or brought up racial stereotypes. Sure, they might make a cheeky remark about another alien race, but not fellow Earthlings. It seemed a bit strange that Paris would take such cracks at Chakotay, but that's just me. I know that I've spent the majority of this letter being critical of Caretaker, but the truth of the matter is, I don't think it's a terrible episode. There was enough of the pilot that I liked for me to find it overall still enjoyable. I think it's achieved its goal of introducing all the main characters and setting up the premise for the series, and I do look forward to watching more later down the line, or just to stop Joseph from pestering me in the chat. Live long and prosper, Willow. Well, Willow, I thought this was a fine letter. And, you know, it really got me thinking again, as the Viceroy of Verisimilitude, that I myself professed Viceroydom of Verisimilitude, of the town of Verisimilitude. I'm the mayor, right? And what does that mean? I mean, I always have to say, what is verisimilitude? Well, it's basically a philosophical concept which states that, in a nutshell, something seems real, the semblance of reality. And I mean that when I talk about verisimilitude, I am speaking of verisimilitude as far as it applies mostly to storytelling, but also to our favorite storytelling, movies, television. Then I love comics and, of course, novels. And I think that the very heart of great storytelling is verisimilitude. Now, an audience needs to believe, which means that a storyteller can't just have a great story to tell. He has to, or she has to, or it has to, or I don't know, any future AI, if there's going to be future AI storytellers, and I'm sure that there will be, making up stories on the fly, they have to make their audience believe. You have to set a stage where, okay, I now believe what's going on moving forward. And a storyteller all the time has to completely reinforce that realism or make you believe what the... Look, and then I'm not saying that fairy tales with all kinds of unreality can't be believable. But when you have the fantastical, you have to give that fantastical, whether it's a premise or characters, you have to provide a framework that defines that fantastical or that science fiction or whatever it is the element is of your story to make you believe. Because if you don't do that, the story falls apart because your audience is going to start asking, wait a minute. And I've said this, you've heard me say this for those of you who've watched this channel for any length of time, you know that I'm constantly talking about this. It's the thing that irks me the most. And we have so many great examples of storytellers that create wonderful verisimilitude in their worlds. We've been talking a lot about Frank Herbert and Dune lately. And talk about world building. Half of Dune is basically setting up all of the different systems and the different peoples and the galaxy itself. We have 3 superhuman factions in Dune: the Mentats, the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood, and of course the Spacing Guild. All people who have been altered by the spice melange, and also the political structure: Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV. And of course we get into, well, Leto and Leto II and all of the different factions, whether you're talking about Caladan and the Atreides or you go to the Harkonnens on Giedi Prime. There's so much in Dune that relies on world building in order for the story to make sense. And Frank Herbert does a wonderful job of that. And by the way, even though I guess I risk getting a copyright strike by saying this, I thought that the screenplay that was certainly changes, but the screenplay with revisions by John Spates and of course by Denis Villeneuve, a fantastic script that does not shy away from the world building. Everything is very well defined. You know exactly where you are and what's happening, and the very, very detailed world of Dune is quite well represented in the script, which just makes me that much more excited about seeing that movie. But verisimilitude is very important. I think the Marvel Cinematic Universe does a pretty good job making you believe in those characters. I didn't know 11 years ago when Iron Man came out, I didn't understand once they started to let loose that they were going to make the Marvel Cinematic Universe as opposed to just another Iron Man movie. I really didn't know. Would I believe that Thor could exist in the world as defined in Iron Man 1? There didn't seem, I mean, as much as the Iron Man suit is pretty fantastical, the rest of the movie is very grounded for the most part. And you believed, man. You believed in Tony Stark and you believed in Iron Man. So were they going to be able to pull off Asgard and the Rainbow Bridge and Odin and Thor and Loki? I mean, would that work? I was surprised how well it actually did work. It was very shrewd to get someone like Kenneth Branagh to direct that movie. And then, of course, we go to Captain America, the Winter Soldier. I mean, Iron Man, I think of all the ways, I look back, of all the superhero characters, Tony Stark is just a guy. And the first Iron Man film is a pretty intimate story about one man's personal reckoning and taking a personal inventory and finding responsibility for the world that he's helping shape. And if you go back and you watch Iron Man 1, I think it's very great. It's a very great movie, a lot of fun, but really it's a very small film. And the central conflict ends up between a man and his mentor and really the direction of how a company is going to be run. And when you jump from that into Thor and then into Captain America, the First Avenger, where you're dealing with super soldier serum and Hydra and the Red Skull, and this is, of course, after we've already been introduced to Thor. So you have your triumvirate of key core members of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in Thor, Captain America, and Iron Man. It works. If any one of those points of an isosceles triangle, I guess, if any one of those points didn't work, there probably wouldn't have been a Marvel Cinematic Universe. But getting Joe Johnston, who directed The Rocketeer and worked on a lot of the Star Wars films, to direct Captain America, the First Avenger was terrific. Of course, Jon Favreau directing Iron Man did a phenomenal job with that. And then Kenneth Branagh, with Thor, you had the right authors to bring us, and you had Kevin Feige, who had a very definite vision, and his people at Marvel, his team at Marvel, knew what they were doing. And as you watched the world building happening, they made you believe. Even with all the outlandishness, they made you believe. Now, what Willow's letter sort of codified, which I thought was very interesting, is all of the questions that she had about the episode had to do with verisimilitude for her. Did they make her believe? And as somebody, and I've always found this interesting, how so many scientists have been inspired by Star Trek, and yet they're willing to let some of the craziness that are in these episodes and in episodes of Star Trek slide. And as a PhD, our doctoral candidate, Willow Yang, and by the way, when she finally gets her PhD and submits her dissertation, we're going to have to do something on this channel. We're going to have some kind of a party or something. I think it'd be fun. Maybe it'll be a virtual party, but a party nonetheless. And that could be a lot of fun to celebrate Willow's PhD. But it made me think about our universes. And I go back from an early age when I was reading Tolkien. I mean, the first thing I encountered, of course, was The Hobbit. And The Hobbit, obviously, he hadn't done a lot of the work that he later did with Lord of the Rings, and then all the appendices and the Silmarillion and all of the world building that he had done. But The Hobbit, even The Hobbit, as a pretty straightforward children's story, world building, the whole book is creating new worlds. And I know that a lot of it is based on his beloved pre-World War I England. I get all that. I understand. But Tolkien, to me, is one of the masters of world building. And when you go in and so much of the detail in his books were not necessarily necessary to tell the story, but it gave you such a rich look at Middle Earth. And I think part of the appeal of specifically the Lord of the Rings trilogy is what he brought to that. I mean, it was so compelling. Every page. Somebody I thought recently that did it, well, not recently now, 30 years ago, who did a wonderful job. One of my favorite science fiction books I've ever read is Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash. Snow Crash, if you haven't read Snow Crash, it's one of the most entertaining books that I've ever read. It's also very heady, but in terms of how it portrays its virtual worlds and everything that happens, first of all, it's outlandishly entertaining. And from the first page, when hero protagonist, Hiro, hero protagonist, our main character, is delivering pizzas on his rocket-powered skateboard for Uncle Enzo's Cosa Nostra Pizza, I was hooked, man. I don't think I read that first page. I remember cracking that open and like, man, this book is good. But it made you had to believe. And he really thought it out. I still think one of the most compelling virtual or cyber worlds that's ever been detailed in any book is The Street, as presented by Neil Stephenson in Snow Crash. And of course, you go back to the granddaddy of cyberpunk novels, which is of course William Gibson's Neuromancer, which came out 6 years before. But Neuromancer certainly took a page from everything from heavy metal, European comic books to Blade Runner. But when you get to Snow Crash, it really expanded those ideas. And part of the reason I love that book was the world building, and it made me believe. But I think, verisimilitude is incredibly important in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Because again, you need to set up the parameters of your world. And we, the audience, we human beings, we live in our world today. We understand the experience of living here. We know what it's like to have a wooden desk. We know what it's like to drive down a freeway at 60 miles an hour. We know what it's like to go to school. We know what it's like to get married. We know what it's like to travel transcontinentally or intercontinentally on a jet. We understand, we know what it's like to stand at the lip of the Grand Canyon. We have an understanding of the world around us. So when you are creating fictional worlds, your beginning of all of this is our human experience of the world that we live in today. Everything is extrapolated from that reality. So if somebody wants to create, say, futuristic medical technology, their futuristic medical technology has to seem like it could be extrapolated upon what we have today. And as long as an author or a filmmaker can do that for you, then they can tell the story and have that magical, well, it would seem magical to us, but that medical technology, if that plays a part in the story, if it's properly set up, then you believe. And traditionally science fiction, or future set science fiction, has to do that because it's part of the, I think it's part of the attraction, because I think anybody who loves science fiction, you're attracted to the possibilities of existence. To love science fiction is to be inherently optimistic, I think. Even though so much about science fiction can be dystopian, so much about science fiction, even reading Dune, all the things that go on in Dune, especially after Dune and Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, there's some bleak stuff that goes on there. But, Dune takes place 10,000 years from now. And so it's inherently optimistic because humanity will have spread out amongst the stars. We've got the Spacing Guild who can fold space. You've got the psionic powers of the Bene Gesserit, and you've got the human computers and the Mentats. Humanity's flourishing in Dune. So there's something inherently optimistic about that idea, which I think is, I think it's important, and it means something. It has value. Now, one of the things that has bothered me, bringing it back to Star Trek, as was pointed out by Willow, Star Trek hasn't always been great or consistent with its verisimilitude, and the people pointed out, certainly my beloved Best of Trek anthologies. They're in those Best of Trek anthologies. Leslie Thompson, who I've spoken about often, wrote columns, Star Trek Mysteries Solved, and would go through and address various inconsistencies in the Star Trek universe and offer intelligent and well thought out arguments as to or to sort of figure out where things fit in the Star Trek universe, even though they appeared to be contradictory. Leslie Thompson was always trying to offer an opinion of how this could be reconciled with the information that we had. And I think one of the I mean, certainly Star Wars is a rich universe full of lore, and we like to know all of those things. I mean, an X-Wing fighter was built by what is it? Is it Incom? There's the Kuat shipyards. You know, we know all of these terms as Star Wars fans. Same is true of Star Trek fans. There's the Star Trek Encyclopedia. There's the Star Wars Encyclopedia. We love all that minutia because all of those details help the universe come to life. And I think all of that's incredibly important. And, you know, Better Call Saul came back last night. And one of the great things about both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul is the world building. I mean, sure, it's set in New Mexico. I get that. And it's set predominantly in the real world, of course, unless you're taking drugs or there's flashbacks or things like that. And in Better Call Saul, we had flash forwards. But the idea is it makes you believe. The storytelling, the twists and the turns make you believe. Vince Gilligan and his cohorts making those shows, you never stop and go, wait a minute. If this happens, then how could this happen? And that's why Breaking Bad is a great show, because they don't do things that make you go, huh? Like what? Whereas I think one of the problems with, say, Star Trek, especially over the last 10 years, is there has been so little attention paid to verisimilitude. So little attention has been paid to world building and making an audience believe. J.J. Abrams is the king of glossing over things. His mystery box storytelling that he's so fond of makes it so you don't have to explain everything. You just leave the audience dangling. You leave questions open, and you don't necessarily have to answer them. Well, as far as Star Trek is concerned, it really bothers me. And the kind of Star Trek fan that I am, I've read all the reference books. You know, I've read Star Trek novels, where one of the great things about all the Star Trek novelists is that they do fill in those blanks. They do the research, and they make things seem so real. I remember reading Diane Duane's The Wounded Sky, which was loosely adapted, sort of, for the episode Where No One Has Gone Before in the first season of TNG. That is Tallulah barking. But she has yet to come in here. And I liked the novel because it talked about, oh, look who it is. Okay, I wondered where you were. I've been on the show for a while, and you, Tallulah, hadn't got up to bark. What are you? Were you just not? You didn't know I was here? There's a cookie for you. One more for you. And one more for you. And one more for you. And that's it. Let's hope you don't bark anymore, Tallulah. She'll bark, though, so I apologize. But, you know, if I don't have the dogs on, people are like, where are the dogs? I tune in for the dogs. Got to have the dogs. Who else has such a barky, yappy, crazy Irish doodle? I don't know. Who, by the way, was born on a Amish farm in Pennsylvania a year and a couple of months ago. Right, Tallulah? You're a good girl, even though you're insane. Oh, did you want to come up and be on camera? Do you want to be on camera? Huh? Do you? Is that what you wanted? Yeah, I know. Yes. Okay, I got to get back to the show. Can I get back to the show? Huh? I know, you look around. No one likes the Robservatory more than Tallulah does. By the way, Tallulah ate my Black Klansman Blu-ray. You did. You ate my Black Klansman. It's Black History Month, and you ate my Black Klansman Blu-ray, my 4K disc. I found it on the ground. It's very distressing. She did it. She's unremorseful. I'm going to tell Spike Lee. Anyway, so the idea of verisimilitude. No, no. Sit. You be good. Be good. No barking. No barking. No. No. She's going to bark anyway. But so anyway, getting back to Star Trek, where I was saying, hey, Tallulah, you can't do that. You can't bark. But getting back to verisimilitude, now that I've lost my train of thought, I think one of the things over the last 10 years, like I was saying, that's problematic for Star Trek is there isn't even an attempt to create the kind of verisimilitude that used to exist in Star Trek. And when I was a kid, maybe because I was less discerning, but I believed the original series. Now, there's a lot of people now, I understand, they're like, okay, well, you know, there's things in it that maybe you can't believe, but they did go out of their way to make you believe. I mean, and they did that by giving you parameters of all the fantastic technology. I mean, sure, yeah, they could be inconsistent, but for the most part, they really tried to make sure that, okay, you have transporters, but ship-to-ship interbeaming, you know, those kinds of things. They couldn't just do that. You had to have line-of-sight transportation, and there were frequently things that would stop being able, you couldn't use the transporter. I mean, obviously, The Enemy Within, early episode of the first season had some of the crew was marooned on a planet. They couldn't get beamed up, and this weather had moved in, and they were going to freeze to death. And I have people like, well, why didn't you use the shuttlecraft? Well, I would presume, I mean, there's reasons why, because from a production standpoint, but I would presume that same storm that caused them not to be able to beam anybody up would cause a shuttlecraft. You couldn't land one in any close to that. But anyway, I mean, I bought Star Trek. Well, I read an article about Star Trek Picard that I've posted and I've been talking about, and I wanted to address. I think it was a pretty good article. Of course, there's a lot of people that have been debating this article online, but I wanted to, I'm going to read some of it, not all of it. It's a really long article, but I really thought it was quite good. And in terms of addressing verisimilitude. Actually, before I get into that, why don't I see there's people that have been firing in. Let's do this first. Firing in some questions. Let me go down to Anonymous. Said, I'm a little pissed, Rob. Disney Plus will release The Mandalorian in Europe in a weekly manner also. On the physical media front, David Cronenberg's Crash will get a 4K release on April 9th. And Rollerball will get a 4K release on March 27th. Rob, you know where. I do know where. For those of you who love physical media, Amazon Germany, for whatever reason, the beautiful 4K restoration of David Cronenberg's Crash, one of my favorite films by him, is going to be released Germany only on 4K first. Also, as Dieter Bastian would love to hear me say, Deutschland. Deutschland is going to have a rollerball. Get this, Norman Jewison's original rollerball from 1975, which is one of my favorite 70s science fiction films, is going to be released in a 4K restoration in a 5-disc box set, ladies and gentlemen. 5 discs. That's coming out March 27th, and then we get, 2 weeks later, we get Crash in 4K. Deutschland, the Germans are killing it, which is good, and I will support them wholeheartedly. Since I'm reading now, I'm gonna put on my reading glasses. Willow sends in a tip and says, in Caretaker, the Ferengi who tried to rip off Kim asked if he was going to pay in cash or credit. Humans must use some form of currency. Why would the Ferengi even bother if they knew humans had no money? Well, I think there are economic systems in Star Trek. They're just not the same kinds of economic systems that we have necessarily now, because the Ferengi have money. The Ferengi have currency. Obviously, they're looking for gold-pressed latinum all the time. So there's probably some kind of, there's got to be a way that species that do have economic systems that are different from where Earth has evolved to, there's got to be a way to do commerce. Now, one of the things the article I'm going to read brings up is, in the Star Trek universe, you have replicator technology. And it's 3D printing, but with replicators, you can have anything. You can replicate food. And one of the things that I often thought about, and this was brought up in this article that I'm going to read, in Star Trek Picard, Raffi basically is supposed to be a poor minority, I guess. But she complains that Picard living in his chateau is, a 1%er. And I always thought that was sort of strange because in my mind, this is how I think. So when we first saw Chateau Picard in Family, the first thing I thought about was Robert, Jean-Luc's brother. The reason that Chateau Picard still made wine in the old-fashioned ways because Robert was shown as being an old-fashioned traditionalist. I would assume, again, in my own mind, this is what I believe of the Star Trek universe. I believe in the Star Trek universe with replicator technology because you can get whatever you want to eat. You could probably have a computer sample or whatever. You would analyze using tricorder technology. You could analyze, say, the contents of a certain glass of wine. Whatever your favorite glass of wine is, it's vintage, whatever, because the molecular makeup of wine, whatever wine you liked, could be analyzed and it could be recreated. So there's really no reason to have a vineyard. All you would need is the patterns for your favorite wines and you could keep replicating them. The whole reason that Chateau Picard continued to be a viable vineyard is because Robert Picard liked wine. He liked winemaking. And I think that in the 23rd and 24th century, those kinds of things would be like an art form. There would be a lot of people that would say that, you know what, replicated wine is one thing that computer patterns can probably, it's like me and vinyl. I'm like, come on, man. I understand if you have a $10,000 stereo system. Vinyl sounds warmer. I get it. But there's going to be most people that are like, man, I just want to replicate a bottle of wine. I'm not going to, who cares? But I think that the Picard family, the chateau, was probably passed down through generations. See what I did there? Generations through the family, and they kept being winemakers as more of an art. Because I think in the future, if those are the kind of things that you would want, that's what would happen. If you're going to make instruments, what is it, a luthier? If you wanted to make a guitar, or something like that, there would be people that make guitars out of wood, and those kinds of things would still be valued in society, but more as art, not necessarily. You're not necessarily a 1%er if you have a chateau. I mean, I guess you could be, but it would be different. The economic systems would be different. Anyway, so I think that, to answer your question, Willow, that part of the thing that would happen with human civilization is we would have probably every federation, everybody who was in the Federation, part of what you would be issued is you'd have some kind of access to a currency. Maybe the Federation, maybe Starfleet gave you access to this currency, so you could actually go do business with people. Now, I don't know. They've never actually addressed this on the show, not like that, but that's one of the things that it's easy to say, well, there's no money in the future, we don't have that kind of currency. And then it's another thing when you're butting up against, you go to Quark's bar, he expects you to pay him. Well, I would assume that the Federation, again, Starfleet would exist, as I said, and then they would give you whatever currency you'd have access to it. Maybe it's, I don't know what it is, but it would be specifically to trade with alien races, alien governments, or whatever. Because once you have replicator technology on a mass scale, whether you're making food, who would run out of everything? How would you be poor? But we're going to address that in a while. Chairman Mao sent in a tip and said, Rob, during your conversations with Singer, that'd be Bryan Singer, did you ever ask him why they set X-Men in the near future? Like it made any difference and was quickly forgotten? Well, yeah, I mean, I think that they did that because they wanted viewers to think like this could still happen. They didn't really lean into it that much, but I think it was just something that they, because there'd be future technologies that didn't exist. Adamantium, for instance. That's why. 200 Watt Studios sends in a super chat and says, "Hail Rob, you're spot on regarding Picard." Let's see. Am I? Well, I'm glad you feel that way. Stubble McShave sends in a tip and says, "We don't see the top of the article's letters, and the thing you read is often above the part that's shown to us. Try to read from the center of the page so we can follow along." That's a good suggestion, Stubble. I like that suggestion. I'll do that. Royce Freeman sends in a super chat and says, "I want to see Jojo Rabbit. I've heard folks say that some subjects should not be satirized. How do you feel about the movie?" I think Jojo Rabbit is a terrific film, and I have to say that I, too, started out thinking, how is this going to work? But, one of the things about, again, when it comes to the world at large, and when you start thinking about, like, we look back on history, and I was raised Jewish, so obviously the entire Nazi regime was monstrous. And remember, they didn't just kill 6 million Jews, they killed 6 million other people, and that's before you even get to Russia. Between what the Nazis did to Russia and what Stalin did to his own people, I mean, again, humanity is a just a litany of one horror after another. So go back far enough, and no group of people was safe from some kind of persecution at some time in their lives. But when it comes to Jojo Rabbit, I'm like, look, they were still human beings. There were a lot of people that also were not members of the Nazi Party. Not all of the German military were Nazis. And I think that the show, you have to remember, do you think a kids are still kids? And I thought that ultimately, I thought the movie was, I guess, I'd say it was a good movie, and it was ultimately positive. It was something that you need to remember. It's what the Nazis did was monstrous, and it was horrifying. But I think that the story that Jojo Rabbit tells is absolutely legitimate and worth telling. Lee Crow sends in a tip. Wow, thanks, Lee. Finally not working and catching your show live for once. Just wanted to send in a tip to say thanks for filling my evenings with nerdy commentary. Been watching for about 6 months now. Keep up the great work. Well, Lee, thanks for supporting the channel. I hope that I continue to bring you that. Oh, and you sent in another tip. The video game adaptation I've wanted to see for years is Halo. Halo's great. Probably my favorite sci-fi story or universe. I just think it would be expensive to give it a proper treatment, and no studio wants to take the chance on how risky video game movies are. No, Lee, I think you're absolutely right about that, but you know what? Done right, I think Halo could be great. I really do. It's just they've got to have the right storyline to make it work. But yeah. Richard sends in a tip and says, "I've been thinking through the whole Icheb or Icheb Icheb. It's Icheb, right? Icheb I thing and the reaction to it. I asked myself, what's the difference between that and First Contact? There's even a similar decision. Ensign Lynch, anyone? Well, first of all, Star Trek Picard did nothing to earn that." And Richard goes on, scene. Well, First Contact was a very morally challenged movie. A lot of McKee's center of good, shall we say. Would that be McKee's screenwriting course? Well, Star Trek Picard is completely morally flat. Who do we admire? Who do we even like? Without that center of good, you just end up with hate. I agree, and I'm going to talk about more of that later. Alexander Wilson sent in a tip and says, after Watchmen depicted the Tulsa Black Massacre, Oklahoma schools are going to teach it in their public school. This makes me respect Damon Lindelof even more because he is bringing positive change to the country. Well, Alexander, I totally agree with you. I think learning about the Black Wall Street Massacre, what happened in Tulsa, is something that needs to be discussed, and not just during Black History Month, but for all time, to show how it can always happen here. And I agree with you. I just wish that the I wish that the overall storyline in Watchmen would have supported all of that and where it went. Apple Crow sends in a tip and says, Star Trek Pack-Led. It searches for plot to make it go. Yes. Well, let me get back to this article that I really wanted to share with you. Now, this article comes from Crude Reviews. And they did an article a while back that I really like. I think Crude Reviews is out of the UK. I don't know. This was posted on February 16th. And it was tagged with Brexit, immigration, Picard is back, poverty, Romulans, Star Trek, and Trump. Now, I warn y'all, this is a very political article. And while I don't want to get into a lot of the politics, I'm sharing this article strictly to continue and further the discussion about world building and verisimilitude, and how come world building and verisimilitude are so important to our sci-fi, fantasy, and horror franchises. Star Trek Picard is a story about how modern, technologically advanced civilizations can succumb to hatred and bigotry. Well, that's not entirely true. We never see the descent of that civilization. Star Trek Picard is actually a story about a modern, technologically advanced civilization that has succumbed to hatred and bigotry. Well, okay, that's not precisely accurate either, as we don't actually explore that civilization or its various societies. So really, Star Trek Picard is a story about an arrogant, straight, cisgendered old white man who berates others for their intolerance as he lives in an opulent mansion surrounded by huge swaths of land cared for by unpaid full-time servants. There's also some stuff to do with conspiracies and robots and the Borg. This is a bit of a deep dive, so please settle in. Now, this goes on and he talks a lot about the plot of Star Trek Picard, which I am not going to read. And then I'm going to come down to here. What I actually want to write about is the themes of the show and how poorly understood those themes seem to be by the show's writers. The problem is that the writers do not demonstrate an understanding of what poverty is, or why it exists, or the connection between inequality and bigotry. Patrick Stewart, a lifelong left-winger and supporter of the British Labour Party, is on record as stating that Picard is a response to both Trump and Brexit, and that this is some sort of attempt to address two separate issues that seem inextricably linked by their specific populism: the rise and seemingly political invulnerability of Trump, who has created concentration camps on U.S. soil, and the Brexit movement, which is seeing Britain sabotage its own economic future for the sake of limiting immigration. Now, even I know that sentence, those two sentences, are very politically charged for people. But what I'm hoping that people take away from why I wanted to read this is this author, and I'm not saying I agree 100% with everything the author is saying, is setting up where he wants to go. You don't have to agree with it. I'm not necessarily saying I agree with everything, but what I am going to be talking about is verisimilitude and world building as it relates to Picard, based on what this author is writing. Both issues are anti-immigration. Whilst Brexit lacked an iconic catchphrase, were Britain not an island, it might certainly have been "build the wall." And this ties into the issues at the center of Picard's narrative: the rehoming of refugee Romulans. Just as Britain and Americans voted in line with their apprehensions about immigration, so too the Federation seems to have ruled in line with accepting Romulans across its own border. The parallels run deeper. FNN, the news agency interviewing Picard in the first episode whilst making implications about the value of Romulan lives, is a clear equivalent of Fox News, the private news agency in America, which has presented so many right-wing, nationalistic, and xenophobic talking points. Picard's reference in the same interview to the Dunkirk rescue effort alludes to Britain's former role in supporting its European neighbors and the stark contrast with Britain's now prevailing anti-European national sentiment. But there's a few significant pieces of the puzzle still missing. Fox News was founded by Roger Murdoch and Roger Ailes in October of 1996, almost exactly 5 years before the World Trade Center attack on September 11th. And whilst Fox News was well funded by billionaire investors from the get-go, it is doubtless that the first major attack on the American mainland by a foreign power would have been heavily increased interest in the kind of nationalistic, isolationist opinions that were being pushed by Fox News' array of presenters and guests at the time. Fox News was owned by the News Corporation, also a Murdoch company, which owned UK-based newspapers The Times, The Sun, and the now extinct The News of the World. Murdoch himself has exercised editorial control over The Sun and The News of the World since he took ownership of them in 1969. Yes, more than 50 years ago. And whilst he did not have similar editorial freedom with The Times, he nonetheless had a lot of influence over the publication. Murdoch also founded Sky News in 1989, a British news channel which is nowhere near as outwardly biased as Fox News, but which certainly leans right on the political spectrum. Most people reading this will already understand the role that Fox News has played in modern U.S. politics. Fox News supported President Bush during his 2 terms from 2001 to 2009, was incredibly critical of President Obama during his 2 terms from 2009 to 2017, and has been a staunch defender of President Trump so far through his first term. Most political historians recognize the key significance of Fox News on the American public psyche, not merely because of the commentary it provides, but because of its massive reach, being voted the most trusted news network in America on multiple occasions, reaching 90 million households and being the top-rated cable network as late as 2019. To understand the significance of the Sun in the UK is perhaps a little harder, but here's some anecdotal evidence. Following the Sun's abhorrent coverage of the Hillsborough tragedy in 1989, a popular movement grew in my home city of Liverpool to boycott the Sun newspaper, a boycott which has persisted ever since. A possible consequence? In the 2016 referendum, Liverpool was one of the most staunchly pro-European regions, and in 2019, Liverpool constituencies were some of the best performing for the left-wing Labour Party, which faced disaster across the rest of the UK. The point being, our consumption of media plays a huge role in how our societies progress. Another point being, these are operations that have been going on for decades, since before I was born in some cases, and the consequences of these media operations are proportional to their duration. Fox News did not immediately change the landscape of politics in 1996, but 24 years later it has certainly had its part to play in one of the most dramatic and controversial periods of U.S. political history. Nothing happens in isolation. The World Trade Center attacks certainly did a lot to shift American foreign policy, but even events as evil as that can have different effects on public opinion based on the media response. Had Fox News and other outlets focused less on the role of Islamicism in those attacks and more on the role of prior White House administrations in arming and empowering the very same militant groups that committed those atrocities, the political landscape over the following years might have been quite different. There's another element to all of this. It's very easy for someone like me, an employed, middle-class, educated white dude, to view the recent shift toward bigotry as the fault of a biased media and the people stupid enough to believe in it. I'm lucky enough that most of my friends are not poor. Not many are wealthy by British standards, but most are not struggling to put food on the table. Most of my friends are white and middle class just like me and benefited from a university education just as I did. Most of these friends do not read The Sun or watch Sky News. Most of these friends are anti-Brexit, anti-Tory, diehard leftists, which makes me proud. A lot of people in the UK and in the US are not so fortunate. Many have been made redundant within the last 5 years, or struggled to find an adequate job to begin with. Many have come from much poorer backgrounds without middle-class families to support them through rough times. Many are living in poverty as a result of these factors. And by poverty, I mean simply a lack of access to the services, products, and amenities that are considered necessary for a healthy, happy life. I mean the ability to travel around the country, to buy food, afford shelter and power and health care, and in recent times an internet connection, which is now absolutely a necessary part of our social infrastructure. In our world, poverty is caused by a lack of wealth, which is itself caused by a lack of income. A lack of income means a lack of job for most people. This is why governments will often use welfare programs or Social Security to provide a supplementary or replacement income to those who cannot work or who have lost their jobs and try and prevent them from becoming impoverished. You need income in our modern world because we have what is called scarcity. Food has to be grown. Building materials have to be manufactured. Clothes have to be sewn by exploited sweatshop workers, and movies have to be made by overworked CGI artists who will be laid off after production is finished. Because all of these things are scarce, i.e. finite, and require effort to create, they have a value. That value is paid for with money, which you earn by having an income, which you get by having a job. Even if goods and materials and food are all plentiful and therefore cheap, land is not. We have finite usable land, and by usable I mean land that is solid enough to build on. to close to existing infrastructure, accessible, temperate enough to live in, and not already in use for some other purpose. This means that even if you have everything you need to build a house and live in it sustainably forever, you need somewhere to build it to begin with. Sadly, our society is not yet technologically advanced enough to create land elsewhere, such as in the ocean or in space. And if you think I'm over-explaining all of this, there's a reason for all of that. And I'm going to skip over this. The reality is that a lot of jobs are lost as a result of decisions that were made years before. The wrong CEO was chosen, or new and more efficient technologies were introduced, or the market began to shift and the company never adjusted to meet new demands. Sometimes a company decides to relocate to a more cost-efficient location, and those employees who can't move with it are left behind. But losing your job is often a very sudden and immediate thing. One month you're working and earning a comfortable wage, and the next you're being shown your limited options and a redundancy package if you're lucky. Even though the causes of you losing your job are gradual and long-term, the act itself is rapid and surprising. And this is just the binary of having or not having a job. I've not even touched upon the concept of situations where employment is high and everyone has a job, but salaries have risen more slowly than inflation. It's incredibly difficult to explain to someone who's working 40 hours a week that the reason that they still feel poor is because of nebulous macroeconomic issues that have no ability to affect. They have no ability to affect. Which is all a roundabout way of saying that when you're talking to someone who's trying to understand why they've worked hard all their life but still can't afford basic necessities, simple answers will be more readily accepted. Something like, well, it never used to be this bad before they let all those immigrants in, is just an easier concept to grapple with than, well, you see, in the lead up to the 1929 Wall Street crash, speculative markets overvalued stock prices, which led to... Indeed, it is especially hard to convince someone of the real, highly complex, and long-term causes of their poverty when they see so many people around them protected from that same poverty. If the system in which we live in is malfunctioning, then surely it must be malfunctioning for everybody? And if so, how can there still be people going on expensive holidays, buying sports cars, or living in fancy homes? When faced with that contradiction, you're more vulnerable to a simple answer that is quickly delivered, that is responsible, that is quickly delivered, and that simple answer will conveniently shift the blame from the people who are actually responsible. Then it goes on more about Fox News. But anyway, pulling these issues together, what we're left with is the kind of societies that will elect Trump, the kind of societies that will vote for Brexit. Brexit are societies that are suffering from inequality, from a visible gap between the rich and the poor, and often with no good or comprehensible reason being presented. In fact, every major shift on a national political compass, typically from progressive to conservative in modern history, has followed increases in wealth inequality. And then this goes on and talks about the Iranian Revolution, which I'm not going to read. So how does all of this tie into Star Trek Picard? Well, let's start off by repeating that Brexit didn't happen because everybody's a little bit racist. Trump was not elected because we naturally evolved to be untrusting of foreigners. Both Trump and the architects of Brexit preyed upon a poor working class that was getting poorer. The reason why this author is bringing it up is because Patrick Stewart has said, like we talked about earlier in the article, that Star Trek Picard is a direct response to Brexit and the Trump presidency. Trump wasn't wrong to target his rhetoric at coal mining communities where the mines have shut down, but he was wrong to pretend that those lost mining jobs would ever come back. Boris Johnson was not wrong to use possible economic prosperity as a carrot to dangle in front of impoverished towns in northern England, but he was wrong to suggest that Brexit would ever result in greater income for people in those towns. MAGA hat wearers and Brexiters alike were predominantly people who have been on the harder end of increasing wealth disparity in the US and the UK. The great irony is that they allow themselves to believe in millionaires living lives of privilege, millionaires who are smart enough to provide a simple answer to the economic issues of the day. There are too many immigrants has a brutal simplicity to it that doesn't require an understanding of inflation or industrialization or marginal tax rates. And it's an answer that fits neatly on the front page of The Sun or in the rolling text box on Fox News. Which brings us back to Picard and a couple of big questions. In a world where any kind of material or food can be spontaneously created out of freely available energy, and there is a well-established ability to construct habitats in space, how can there be any scarcity, and hence poverty and economic inequality? If there is no poverty and hence no financial anxiety, how is a Trumpian, Brexity, anti-immigration platform able to gain traction? We see Jean-Luc Picard ordering a decaffeinated Earl Grey tea from a replicator in the well-equipped kitchen in his French mansion, whilst his live-in full-time servants prepare food. Outside in the fields that stretch out to the horizon, automated farm equipment floats by workers who tend vines used to make wine. To the best of our knowledge, based on events portrayed in the series so far, this has been the status quo for Jean-Luc Picard for the last 14 years, since he resigned from Starfleet. We see Rios aboard a ship, a roomy vessel with its own holodeck, bedrooms, presumably other living amenities. His every need is tended to by an apparent army of emergency holo programs. Whiskey is replicated out of thin air directly in front of him, and he smokes cigars. We see Raffi sitting on the porch of her trailer in the Arizona desert, well, actually California desert, a small wind turbine on the roof. She grows her own snake leaf, which she inhales from a vaporizer. She keeps a pump-action rifle on hand. Presumably the area in which she lives is dangerous enough to warrant it. She chastises Picard for his privileged lifestyle in his chateau and calls her own home a hovel, which would be too humiliating to show him. We see a group of Starfleet workers on Mars on the day of the synthetic attack. They swear and joke and complain about their jobs, their robotic colleagues, their awful food, and the selection of which they apparently have no say in. We see a township of Romulan refugees angry at the Federation and at Picard for abandoning them, for leaving them on a dusty planet for 14 years. We watch Picard angrily tear down the Romulans' only sign, pointedly step on it, only to smirk at the onlooking Romulans enter their bar and demand service. How can all of these things be simultaneously be true? How can the same society provide one old man with tracts of land and a mansion to live in with freely replicating tea, whilst depriving a younger woman of any amenities and condemn her to live in a hovel in a desert with a drug addiction? How can the same society force a woman to live in a hovel in the desert, while a man of the same age lives on an advanced spaceship with freely replicating whiskey and holograms to provide for his every need? How can the same society provide unlimited replication of foodstuffs for two men who once worked for Starfleet, but deny those same freedoms to people currently working for Starfleet? The writers of Picard have clearly demonstrated that wealth inequality exists. So they at least have gotten that part right. But could they have failed to explain how that wealth inequality could ever arise when people like Raffi could seemingly just move out of their hovels and live on a spaceship, as she chooses to do at the end of episode 3? The Mars workers complain about the food they are provided with in their office. But if it's so bad, couldn't they not replicate their own food at home and bring it with them? Or are we to believe that these workers are denied access to the same food recipes as Picard and Rios? If so, why? The food replicated is according to a computer program. It does not exist in any form before it's made by the replicator. Where today's wealth inequality is caused by a scarcity of materials, a limited supply of the goods we need to survive, in Star Trek Picard, they have demonstrated a complete lack of scarcity. What social mechanism is it that allows Picard himself to run automated fertilizer machines over his acres upon acres of luxury crop fields, whilst simultaneously denying the Mars workers any variety in their lunch? I can get more variety in my lunch routines from a cafe that runs off 3 ovens and 2 cooks, and yet an advanced replicator, a device which turns stored energy into any kind of matter, somehow has limits imposed upon it for some members of society, but not all? In such a scenario where wealth inequality exists, despite the prevalence of technology capable of solving it, I think even I would start feeling a little Trumpian. If I'm watching Picard being interviewed on FNN from his own personal vineyard while I put up with another portion of brown sticky protein for lunch in my trailer in the desert, when I know that this means to solve my problems exist but are being denied to me, then I would absolutely be feeling like a victim and be looking for someone or some group of people to blame. But Picard is not addressing these systemic issues. In fact, the lead character, Jean-Luc Picard himself, seems oblivious to the economic problems facing the Federation and only addresses the moral concerns of bigotry and hatred. If Picard were truly bothered by the rise of isolationism in Starfleet and the wider Federation, you might think that someone as demonstrably intelligent as him would seek to understand the root cause of the issue. And to do so, all he really needs to do is walk through his own vineyard. Jean-Luc Picard lives his life wanting for nothing. We do not even see him working on his own vines because he has enormous robots and a staff of workers to do that for him. He's elderly, but he has 2 full-time live-in Romulan carers who take care of him. And yet he considers himself better than the rest of Starfleet because he is not a racist? Which raises a question. Does it actually matter if Picard is a racist? Would it make any difference if he was? He castigates the Federation for turning its back on the Romulans, and yet Picard himself has turned his back on billions of Federation citizens by enjoying the enormous privilege in which he lives. I think this was crystallized for me by his interactions on Vashti with the Romulan refugees who live there. 14 years ago, he was visiting them and making promises to bring Starfleet to the aid of Romulans whose sun was about to explode. He then learns that the synths have attacked Mars, at which point he rushes back to Earth to lobby for a renewed rescue effort. After Picard resigned from Starfleet, he never returned to Vashti, nor did he make any other attempts to rescue more Romulans. The refugees there, apparently with no means of leaving for a better home, fell into poverty, living in a dusty town made up of worn-down huts and drinking their woes away. This is addressed in the episode. Picard says of himself, I made the perfect the enemy of the good. He acknowledges that his inability to save every Romulan led him to abandoning all Romulans and sees his flaws in doing so. Except that a couple of scenes later, we see him walking back through the Romulan town. He sees the Romulans only sign, angrily tears it down, triumphantly steps on it, and enters the bar. He demands service from the waiter. Clearly, he disapproves of the Romulan xenophobia, and he is here to show them the error of their ways. A Romulan senator chastises Picard and then attempts to fight him. Picard refuses. The senator is beheaded as he attempts to kill Picard by a dark-haired Legolas, and Picard escapes with this katana-wielding elf Romulan to safely aboard Rios's advanced starship. Here's an interesting point. The first time we see Picard in this episode, he's being shown around a perfect holographic recreation of his study in Chateau Picard by Rios's emergency hospitality holo program. Even when traveling, Picard still gets to enjoy the luxury of his beautiful French country mansion in exacting detail. Picard even comments on how realistic it all is. And this is where we get to that description of Picard as an arrogant, straight, cisgendered old white man who berates others for their intolerance. Yes, xenophobia is wrong. Any kind of intolerance is wrong, absolutely. But what did Picard expect exactly? What did he think the result would be when a group of people were taken from their home by aliens in a bid to save them, only for those same aliens to then abandon the rest of Romulan civilization and leave these refugees here to starve, separated from their culture, their families, and from the basic amenities they had previously enjoyed? Moreover, how fucking arrogant and distasteful it is for Picard to leave these people for 14 years. 14 years! Never to return, never to bring help, never to do anything but watch the vines grow on his enormous estate, drink tea, and be grumpy about the rise of isolationism. And for him to still be framed as the enlightened hero of the story by the writers. Admiral Clancy calls Picard out for his arrogance in thinking he can return to Starfleet and request a ship out of the blue and go save a random woman who may or may not be the daughter of Data. But what about the cold-hearted misanthropy of Picard spending 14 years doing nothing about the apparent inequality within the Federation? Why is it that Jean-Luc Picard, enlightened humanitarian, allows himself to live like a king whilst people like Raffi live in poverty just a transporter beam away? Maybe the story is meant to be about how Picard has succumbed to nihilism and apathy. But if so, why does he care about the Romulans being xenophobic? Why does he chastise Legolas the Sword Elf for unnecessarily taking a life, even when that person was about to kill Picard? Why does he shout at the Fox News interviewer about Starfleet having lost its way, when he himself has done nothing to address the issues that may have actually led to Starfleet losing its way? If we accept that a post-scarcity society, such as the Federation, is still somehow beset with wealth inequality, if we accept that there is somehow enough room for Picard's vineyards but not enough room for Romulan refugees, if we accept that there is somehow no restriction on how much decaffeinated Earl Grey Picard can replicate, but workers on Mars have to make do with flavorless protein, then we must accept that Picard himself is a heartless, hypocritical capitalist who refuses to help those in need. If there is wealth inequality in the Federation, then Picard must be actively complicit with it. If there is no wealth inequality in the Federation, then how on earth did billions of people become nationalistic and isolationist? If Picard is truly about the shift of the US and the UK towards right-wing political beliefs, then why is it not exploring the causes of such changes? Why is it oblivious to the actual root cause of these issues? If Picard is simply about pointing out that anti-immigration platforms and nationalism are bad, then it's not actually doing anything to help its audience understand those issues, and neither is it shining a light on the causes that allow us to take action against them. In fact, Picard seems to revel in the artificial inequality of its universe. It uses that inequality to create edgy and dramatic characters, but so far has failed to address the inequality itself. And if the show is not going to critically assess the causes of rising right-wing ideology or the societal systemic failures at the very heart of it, then the show and its creators are guilty of the same hypocrisy as the protagonist. Clouding the narrative about why people turn to xenophobia and nationalism is harmful, even if the text of the story is critical of those ideologies in their own right. Wine does not feed the masses, and the hero of your anti-Brexit story cannot be a millionaire living the life of a wealthy aristocrat and looking down on backwards foreigners who have the audacity to feel resentment toward a nation that abandoned them. Because the fact is, Trump rose to power because of the backing of other wealthy white men who used instruments like Fox News to drive a wedge into America's wealth divide, whilst other wealthy white Americans wrung their hands about how awful Trump was and yet did nothing to solve the inequality that led to his election. And Brexit came to be because of the backing of those same wealthy white men who used instruments like the sun to drive a wedge into Britain's wealth divide, whilst other wealthy white Britons wrung their hands about how awful Brexit was and yet did nothing to solve the inequality that led to it. And so, now, the hero of Star Trek Picard is a wealthy white man who wrings his hands and gives speeches about how awful isolationism is, how awful it is to turn our backs upon another community, and all the while he's done nothing but benefit from the inequality that has led to it, which puts the writers in a tricky spot, because now Picard will have to end with Picard acknowledging his privilege, abandoning his vineyard, and chastising the Federation for allowing its people to needlessly live in poverty. Otherwise, lifelong Labour member Patrick Stewart will be playing the role of one of those anti-Brexit Tory MPs or anti-Trump Republicans who decry the fall of decency within modern politics, but continue to vote for policies that ultimately led to it. So, I know some people are screaming at me for reading this article, but I want to bring it back not to politics, but to verisimilitude. And what does it mean when you're telling a science fiction story and making people believe in that story? What do you do? How do you build the world? And I think what we're getting, what we've had both in Star Wars and Star Trek, is the people that are building these worlds now are not taking the time that they need to take to make these worlds believable. And I think this article, whether you believe in its politics or not, and clearly the author is a leftist, as he's a self-prescribed leftist, and a lot of this is even too far left for my liking. But the point of this article is, you can't expect to have your cake and eat it too when you're dealing with these kinds of issues. And what I liked, and I take it all the way back, again, I keep bringing this episode up, but when you go to Star Trek, the original series, in the first season episode, Arena with the Gorn, I, as a bloodthirsty little kid, when I first watched that episode, wanted Kirk to deliver that killing blow. And when Kirk stops himself and doesn't do that, and thinks that, you know what, maybe we were encroaching on Gorn space. Maybe that's what we were doing. And he reconsiders. That was very interesting, especially for me as a kid, because, well, Kirk turns out to be correct. That was the right decision. The Metron shows up and says, hey, you, Kirk, have shown us a quality of mercy. That's something we didn't expect. That's what nuanced storytelling does. It takes you to some place. You think something's going to happen. You're waiting. You as an audience have been led to believe that this giant lizard monster, they massacred all the people that lived on Cestus 3. He deserves to die. So does his shipmates. But what happens? Great Star Trek pulls the rug out from under you and makes you reconsider what you're seeing. Now, I hope maybe Picard can do that. But one of my problems with Star Trek Picard is I watch these episodes and none of it makes any sense. Of course, eating slop, we've seen that in other science fiction movies, and they dispense the horrible whatever it is that they're eating. And they've done all that. Like this author points out, why would anywhere in the Federation, because you're working on Mars, it's an absolute cliche to make these workers not get good food. Why wouldn't they? Like this points out, and that's one of the things that really bothers me about the world building. Any guest on board the Enterprise could get whatever they wanted. They're shown, hey, here's what the replicator can produce. You can get anything you need. Now, some might say that, well, that's because starships are luxurious places. No, it's not because of that. It's because that's what a replicator does. There should be no limit on what a replicator can do. What difference does it make? What food it's going to replicate for you? And the problem with Star Trek Picard is all of this is so steeped, as this article points out, in the 21st century. It's all steeped in things that we've seen before, and none of it makes any sense. None of it makes any sense. Now, I know a lot of people don't care. They just want to be entertained. But for me, when I'm watching these shows, and I feel that when you're watching something and you want to be convinced, you want to believe in all of this stuff, it's up to the writers and it's up to the producers and directors of these shows to make you believe in them. And I feel like modern Star Trek keeps piling up disbelief upon disbelief upon disbelief, to the point where you're watching this and you don't even know what the point of the story that you're watching is anymore. I really don't know. I mean, someone had pointed out to me that I used an example of, in Reunion, when Kalar comes back and Duras kills Kalar, and then Worf goes and kills Duras. And people say, see, there's murder on Star Trek. There's been murder before. There's been an eye for an eye. Well, here's the thing. In Klingon society, that behavior is okay. It falls within the realm of Klingon law, Klingon tradition. So while it is shocking and it is cold-blooded, within the Klingon tradition, it's not necessarily something that's bad, but also it's not shown as being something that's necessarily, I mean, we know what Worf is, and that whole episode was drenched in tragedy. Kalar's death was very tragic. Everything that happened is tragic, and you're not supposed to, you're not ultimately screaming, fuck yeah, when he kills Duras. You might for a minute, but then the tone of it is not such that you should not revel in what's happening. It's not meant to do that. This kind of killing is not a good thing. It's not shown to be a good thing. So I think tonally it's very different. And that's and sure, there's always been lots of killing in Star Trek. There's been lots of death, but it's never been presented as an eye for an eye. That justice has not existed. And, that's one of the things I think is different. I think the tone of all of Star Trek, all of modern Star Trek, even the ads now with the characters hoisting up the Federation flag, like as if it's Iwo Jima or something, is again, I don't recognize this kind of Star Trek, and I think I've found the messaging in Star Trek since 2009 to be incredibly muddled, and that's one of the frustrating things. There was always, at the end of the day, an aspirational message, and the same is true of Star Trek. I don't see people say, well, you don't know where the story's going. But you don't have to wait till the end of a story to find it to be aspirational. I felt the same way about, in a way, the original Star Trek is aspirational. The original Star Wars is aspirational. I've talked about this before. You've got a farmer, a truck driver, and a veteran of foreign wars teaming up for an insurmountable task, and they basically complete the task and save the universe. So Star Wars is aspirational. Ultimately, it's about these disparate, quirky characters that team up and overcome their differences and are able to accomplish a goal. They rescue the princess and destroy the Death Star. So Star Wars in itself is aspirational. And the idea becomes that, Luke, even though later it's discovered his lineage is from the Force, but in the first Star Wars, it's not. In the first Star Wars, the energy of the Force surrounds us and binds us all together. Anyone can tap into the Force. Anyone can train themselves. Some people might be more adept than others, just like some people are more talented than others in doing a lot of things. But if a human being can train, you can get better doing just about anything. You might not win any track and field events, but you can teach yourself to run faster. You can teach yourself to maybe be part of an Olympian relay team or something. And in the first Star Wars movie, certainly, it was something Luke represented us, the everyman. To a certain extent, Han Solo did as well. And I feel that all of that has now sort of been lost in the Star Wars franchise, but it comes back to the world building. In Star Wars, you believed it because it filled in just enough that you weren't asking yourselves, well, wait a minute, if A and B and C are true, then D, E, and F should also be true. You went with it because it made you believe. And as Star Wars got more complicated and the storylines became more in-depth, and we learned more about the history, and there was a lot more world building, there was a lot more responsibility by the writers and the producers and the directors to fill in those blanks. And I think that one of the reasons that there is so much acrimony from fans these days, whether you're talking about Doctor Who or whether you're talking about Star Wars or whether you're talking about Star Trek, is because where these franchises are falling down on. Now, that's not to say there's a lot of people that like this stuff, because a lot of people are, I'm not going to say, it has nothing to do with a level of intelligence. It really has why are you watching television and movies in the first place? A lot of people want to just be entertained. Like, my mother does not watch a Star Trek movie the way I watch a Star Trek movie, but she loves Star Trek 4. Star Trek 4 presented it was easy to understand. She liked the premise. In her mind, she wasn't thinking about Star Trek canon or the past or the future or whatever about the Star Trek universe. She was thinking about the premise they set up. And the premise they set up, you got to go back in time and bring 2 humpback whales in the future. Well, when you're given that premise and you're going back to San Francisco, Star Trek 4 does a really good job of entertainingly going and showing what those characters, what fish out of water in that situation would go through. And it was lighthearted and humorous enough that it kept you entertained as you're watching it. And you're not going, wait a minute, hang on a second, this contradicts this and this does. They did a good job of making you not think about those things. They made you believe. Let's not talk about ILM substandard effects in that movie, but and shaking matte paintings. Like, I'm looking at you, Cetacean Institute. I won't get into that. But for the most part, Avatar, another movie. Avatar is all about its world building. Half that movie is spent building the world that you're seeing. You know, you've got voiceover, you're watching the Na'vi, you're Jake Sully, you're being shown this fantastical alien world through his eyes, and you believe it, man. You believe it. You're not thinking about, well, wait a minute. They make you believe. And that's why that movie is, well, now it's the second most popular movie, the second most successful film of all time. But the reason people loved Avatar, and I think that people forget that now because, hey, our society's, we're a little hipper and cooler now. We've seen it all, but remember that movie came out over a decade ago. We weren't as smart back then. But people believe another. My mom's my litmus test. When I take her to see movies like this, she loved Avatar. She loved every minute of it. And I use her. My mom is the every person. She represents to me the average moviegoer. And if my mom likes a movie and she can be transported away, that movie succeeds. I've told this story. I'll tell it again. Raiders of the Lost Ark didn't make my mom believe. Didn't make my mom believe. I told the story how when we were coming back, we were driving back from the Factoria Cinemas in Bellevue, just across the bridge from Mercer Island. We're driving home, and my mom just kind of shaking her head. I couldn't drive yet, so mom's driving. And my mom says, I said, Mom, what'd you think of the movie? And she's like, that could never happen. I'm like, what? She goes, that could never happen. And I go, what do you mean? She goes, well, and my mom's really grappling. I can see she's really grappling with this. She's like, well, when Indiana Jones is hanging off the truck and being dragged along behind the truck with the dirt and the gravel flying up in his face, he could never hang on to his bullwhip. He would have let go. He couldn't get pulled along the gravelly road like that. For my mom, that was where verisimilitude ended, was with that gravelly road. Now, was she right? I don't know. But she was right for her. And what was really interesting is I realized that as a viewer myself, I believed that Indiana Jones could do that. I believed that he could handle, and it was not easy. It was certainly a hardship. But for my mom, who's, was a very anal retentive perfectionist growing up, there wasn't a lot of dirt in our household anywhere. You could probably lick off the floors. Certainly her house now, even though she has 2 cats, her house is immaculately clean. There's not one surface that doesn't look brand new. I don't know how she does it. I don't know how she did it when I was growing up, but she manages to do it. It's unbelievable. My mom is incredible. So I can understand having dirt flying in your faces to my mother about the worst thing she could possibly imagine. But anyway, verisimilitude, the reality of making your audience believe. And when you're working in a previously existing fictional universe that audiences have loved. And it's interesting now because we're in fan circles, we're seeing Star Trek, Star Wars, and Doctor Who are all suffering from this. They're suffering from it because the creators that are currently running these franchises are not spending the time doing the kind of world building, and yet their stories are steeped in the lore of this. Star Trek Discovery, let's make it a prequel. Let's bring Sarek on. Let's bring Spock on. Let's bring Pike on. Let's bring Number 1 on. And let's bring all of this baggage on that's going to make it even that much harder to write for all of these characters because we're not spending enough time looking into their backgrounds anyway. Now we've got the Cybermen in the new issue of the new episode of Doctor Who. The Cybermen have a long, rich history, a lore that, travels back farther than the Borg, way farther than the Borg. And is their lore being taken in? Is Chris Chibnall taking is he taking in his show writers? Are they taking in all of this? No, because the problem is they want to use these stories. They want to use all of these things in the playground, but they don't want to do the work that it takes to make audiences believe. Now, a lot of people, look, like I said, people who love Picard are going to love Picard. They love Discovery. They love Discovery. And I noticed that I've got both. I have friends that are old Star Trek fans that have been around for a long time. They can love Star Trek Discovery. There's a lot of people that love Discovery. There's a lot of new audience members that love Discovery. But they love these things differently than I think a lot of my constituency, a lot of you imagination connoisseurs, you members of the Post-Geek Singularity. I think you love these things kind of the way I love these things. And when the homework is not done, it becomes irksome. It becomes irksome. And you wonder to yourself, I think a perfect example is when Benedict Cumberbatch says his name is Khan, and you can hear a pin drop in the theater because the audience, the astute audience, knows. Well, okay, other than our memories of Star Trek, most of the audience, you can't even expect them to know who Khan Noonien Singh is. There's no explanation in Into Darkness, aside from some cursory mention of his past, what kind of person Khan is, why he's doing anything that he's doing in that movie. Because they figure, well, doesn't everybody already know from pop culture? No. You have to recontextualize your mythology in every story that you tell. You can't just expect pop culture knowledge that's been baked into our civilization over the last 50 years to carry you through storytelling. You've got to do the work. Got to do the work. I come back to a movie like Creed. Creed does its world building. You get it. I mean, yeah, sure. You have to understand the rest of the Rocky movies, and it helps if you've seen them all. It helps if you've certainly seen Apollo Creed and Rocky 1, 2, 3, and 4. But it assumes you know those things. But with Star Trek Picard, for instance, they're just adding all these things willy-nilly. I mean, let's put 7 of 9 in. Well, how did she get there? Certainly, how did she just happen to arrive in all of space at this one planet to pull the bacon out of the fire? Like, what? And okay, it's 7 of 9, but what if you're a Fenris Ranger? What happened to you the last? I mean, what? Why aren't you working on the Borg cube with all of these reclaimed Borgs? You're a Borg. I'm sure you could get like special dispensation. Wouldn't there be a Borg Research Institute? I mean, wouldn't she like be the head of Starfleet's Borg Sciences and Study Division? I mean, wouldn't she be? I don't know. Anyway, I could go on and on and on about this topic, and I just want to believe, man. I just want to believe. That's what I want. I want to believe. And so do you. So do you. You want to believe as well. That's what you want. Let's see. There's people sending in. Zachary King sent in a tip and said, Viceroy, today was the day. I received my Hunt for Red October 4K in the mail. Also, did you see the latest NECA figures to come out of the New York Toy Fair? Great figures from Jaws, Alien, and They Live. Yes, the NECA is they are making 8-inch, like Mego-sized figures of Quint and Brody from Jaws. Back when Icons was making toys, my friend Darren Doctorman showed me they were going to do a line of Never Were toys. And some of the first figures they had done mock-ups were for Jaws figures. I've wanted Jaws figures for a long time. And that Sheriff Brody figure, the likenesses of Quint and Brody are great. But what I love about that Sheriff Brody figure is that the haircut is enough so I can have somebody make me a Joe Gideon. I'm going to make an All That Jazz action figure, because it's one of my favorite movies. So yes, and the Hunt for October figure, the Hunt for October 4K disc, it would come out here tomorrow, but that's something I definitely want. That steelbook is badass, so I'm glad that you got yours. How cool is that? Attic Hatch Sound sent in a tip. Heard you talking about seeing the Cinerama, while watching a film inside that theater. Some friends and I had a similar experience in the 80s. We were watching the porno Fire Down Below in the cave, replete with machete boulders on Hollywood Boulevard. Magic. What Attic Hatch Sound is referring to is when I saw Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I was in the Cinerama Dome opening night, and you see the Cinerama Dome come on the screen. It was very surreal. Well, I don't know Fire Down Below, but I appreciate that you saw it there. How much fun would that have been? My friend Roberto Suarez sends in a tip and says, since the Federation no longer uses money, wouldn't members of the Federation just replicate Latinum in order to do business with the Ferengi? You know what? Probably, but I would assume that you could tell the difference, just like we can tell the difference between manufactured diamonds and natural diamonds. There's probably a way. But yeah, I mean, in a society, that's a very good point. In a society where you can replicate everything, couldn't you just replicate gold-pressed latinum? Or there must be maybe there's a certain, I don't know, radiation signature. There's got to be. I would assume Now, again, they've not really gotten into this, but I would assume that there's some kind of marker in the future that makes it so you can't just replicate it. You can't just make counterfeit latinum. JB Bonifacio sends in a super chat and says, which chicken sandwich do you prefer, Chick-fil-A or Popeyes? Man, that is a tough question. I got to say, I mean, I hope I don't get canceled for saying this, but yes, I have gone to Chick-fil-A. There's one close. I had never eaten at Chick-fil-A in my life. And I think I've been there 4 times total. And I do like their spicy chicken sandwich. And I love Popeyes as well. But I might have to give the edge to Chick-fil-A. You know, but I'd have to do a taste test. But that's a good question. Maybe I should do that as a video for Robservations. Richard sends in a tip and says, just one thing about 7. If one character is going to execute someone for revenge, wouldn't it be her? She doesn't have the morality of a Starfleet officer. If it came from anyone, it didn't come from trying to be a better parent than her own. Continued. Outside of that, how many times did 7 argue to Janeway, why don't we kill them and leave them to their deaths when it came to big moral decisions? Don't get me wrong, there are some things I didn't like. Accent and whiskey come to mind. Well, you know, here's another thing. Where was 7 in all of this? I know she was hunting down her girlfriend or whatever their relationship is. It was strongly insinuated they had some romantic relationship, which kind of came out of nowhere. But all of that just didn't... I would imagine that if Icheb was serving on a Federation ship, how would he get there? I mean, I would think that the reclaimed Borg that were part of Voyager would be some of the most valued people in the Federation. That they would be part of an institute. Why would you cut any of those people loose? You know, I mean, it's such a strange... You know, Trek Yards, I think Trek Yards, by the way, is doing a video, as I'm on now, doing a video about the fall of the neutral zone, the fact that there's no neutral zone. I'm actually going to go watch. But, yeah, I mean, I just think that, again, I don't want to have these questions. You know, there's too many questions that I have. Like, why would anybody allow trafficking of Borg technology? I would think that Borg technology or the Borg themselves would be protected. Like, what? Who's protected? Where is the Federation? As a matter of fact, we haven't seen one Federation starship in this whole show, and it's such an odd thing to me. I don't get it. Anonymous sends in a tip and said, why wouldn't there be different quality replicators? Higher dollar ones create higher resolution, better tasting food, like having a hi-fi stereo rather than a boombox. Both of them make sound using the same principle, but produce very different results. Well, that's probably, I think that's a good point. But first of all, again, you're stratifying culture. And why would you do that? You know, if you're using, like, I think this, again, is 20th century thinking, 21st century thinking. I think that, especially if you have laborers, as I've talked about on this show before, if you have laborers that are working for you, you want them happy. You know, look, I don't even understand why there are laborers. Why wouldn't you have drones? Like, why are you building anthropomorphized synths anyway? Why don't you build like 10-armed synths that are built to do the work? Like, I would think the Utopia Planitia shipyard wouldn't have synths, but Android, all kinds of mechanisms that were drones that were making things. And again, making humanoid synths rebel is it comes from a different kind of a franchise. It also shows, like, in my mind, it shows such limited thinking, because it doesn't make sense. If you're building ships, why would you necessarily build humanoid robots or humanoid androids, synths? Would that be the best use? Are humanoids the most effective people to be building starships? I would think that they wouldn't be. And if you did need humanoids to build starships, why aren't they just holograms? I don't understand. Like, why are you building synths in the first place? If we see on Rios' ship, his ship is mostly crewed by holograms. He's one dude. Well, wouldn't that be true of every place? Wouldn't you have like all of your workers be holographic? Then you wouldn't have to give them lunch anyway. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. Again, no verisimilitude. You've got synths and you have holograms. Why? I don't know. JB Bonifacio sends in another super chat and says, okay, real question. How did you like Clone Wars Season 7, Episode 1? I'm an instant fan of The Bad Batch, and I thought the action and animation were top-notch. I keep forgetting to watch it. I'm sorry. I will watch it. Tonight. I keep forgetting. Jedi and a friend to Alita sent in a tip and said, I just rewatched Alita Battle Angel on my new 75-inch TV in 4K, and I feel so sad for Rosa Salazar and everyone who worked on Alita that it didn't even get a nomination for VFX. How did this happen? You know, I don't know. I think because probably a lot of it was simply animated, even though I thought Alita absolutely deserved a VFX nomination. But again, you know, you have those departments, they are in charge of nominating for their departments. So I don't know. I'm a big fan of Alita. I hope we get to see another one. I really would like to see another one. I hope one day perhaps we will. Let's see. I think I'm going to read another letter, because why not? I only read one today. I should go back and see what other... Oh, this is a good one. Since we're talking about Star Trek, let's talk about Deep Space Nine. And this is a very, very cool letter. Let's check it out. This letter comes to us from Bob Kowal. Greetings, Mr. B. Oh, sommelier, my sommelier. It breaks my heart when I listen to you lament the current cheapening of Trek. I've since been revisiting older Star Trek to cleanse the palate. Star Trek Deep Space Nine in particular. I've never really played the favorite captain game. Each have their own strengths, but in revisiting Deep Space Nine, I've come to favor Avery Hawk Brooks as Benjamin Sisko. Sisko demonstrates all the strengths and charisma of the other captains and commanders, but with one added element. He is as equally dedicated to family as he is to duty. His unapologetic nurturing love of his son, his reverent grieving of his wife, he even visits with Dad. Even his visits with Dad flesh out his character in ways not seen with other Star Trek leaders. Look at all these things. Look at all these ads. Oh, I didn't mean to go do that. Oops. At a glance, this emotional openness may make him seem more vulnerable, but we come to learn it is the heart of his strength. This vulnerable openness serves as a nice counterpoint to Sisko's Hawk command mode. In this mode, he is arguably more authoritative, intimidating, even cunning than any of the captains who are generally married to their careers. Note, when I say mode, it's not like there's a flip of a switch, just trying to convey the range of character, something Avery Brooks pulls off seamlessly. This commitment to family also informs his approach to command. There's a fatherly quality in his treatment of crew and cohorts. They do not become a surrogate family, as does happen in other Star Trek shows. They become his extended family. He manages to garner loyalty from people of disparate cultures who are not strictly bound by Starfleet code. People with their own unique agendas and commitments. All concede Sisko being hailed as the prophesized emissary doesn't hurt in this regard. The fatherly element of Sisko's character is particularly suited for his duties on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. He deals with mundane daily administrations as well as cosmic crises. He never has the option to escape a situation at warp speed. He stays put to deal with the ramifications of his decisions in the short term, long term, and even in generational terms. All this talk about how Sisko is written would be irrelevant if the actor playing him was not up to the task. Avery Brooks may be as fine of an actor as even Sir Patrick Stewart. Maybe the only other Star Trek lead actor who could command a stage with a one-man show, Paul Robeson. I'll finish by reflecting on what may be Trek's most intimate yet emotionally powerful episode, The Visitor, Star Trek Deep Space Nine Season 4, Episode 2. Without spoiling, the episode has both elements of brilliant sci-fi and tragic ghost story. Jake's torment, the poignant interactions of father and son over a lifetime, Jake's solution, and Sisko's response to that solution. I get verklempt every time I think about it. I would argue that the episode could not have happened without Avery Brooks' Sisko and this commander's commitment to family. Bob K, a.k.a. Attic Hatch. Well, Bob K, I cannot agree with you more. I think that I've often talked about how the portrayal of Avery Brooks' relationship with Sisko's relationship with his son, Jake, is one of the cornerstones of Deep Space Nine, and it was diversity, and it was showing it had a far better portrayal of say the black experience of one man and his. I mean, I know it's Deep Space Nine, so it's a science fiction show, but still, to have a single father, a widowed single father, on a space station that was balancing family and duty with his son Jake, and they had a loving relationship where his son respected him, he respected his son, and he respected his father, as we saw in Brock Peters later on in the series. What a wonderful portrayal that is. And I mean, you know, people are always saying to me about, well, Rob, you know, Deep Space Nine doesn't support Roddenberry's utopian vision of the future. But the people did. You know, the characters did. And the Starfleet characters, you know, they were railing against the dying of the light out on the frontier. And they were able to, sure, the Dominion War changed it all, but the Dominion War, like all Star Trek threats that help us illuminate the times we live in, came from the outside. And yes, in Homefront, of course, we saw how dangerous this could be. But that was thwarted. It was taken care of, and Starfleet did sort itself out. I mean, yes, questionable tactics. But you know what? While Sisko in the Pale Moonlight is a rough episode, but it asks tough questions. But it's not like that show doesn't talk about the ramifications of how horrific what's going on there really is, and what does it mean. So I would say that it did, in fact, become I think Deep Space Nine is an uplifting show. And, yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. It might be my second favorite Star Trek series. This one comes from Klimt Eastwood. What a funny name. Klimt Eastwood. Gustav Klimt. Dear Rob, I'm a fan of Star Trek, although nowhere near as knowledgeable as you or some others in the Post-Geek Singularity, and I've been trying to make sense of the criticisms of Star Trek Picard. I should say, I want to love new Star Trek. I really, really want to love it, both for personal reasons, my favorite show ever, and for, I guess you could say, political reasons. I want to love it too. It gives me no pleasure not to love Star Trek. I want hope. I want badly for someone to come along without patronizing us, the audience, or dumbing it down to the ground and telling us a story about what sort of society we could be. What we could look forward to if we just got ourselves together and dragged ourselves out of this kindergarten of humanity we live in. Unfortunately, the Star Trek Picard isn't doing this, just as Star Trek Discovery didn't, but could have. The first level of Star Trek Picard's failing is the plethora of questions it keeps posing. Yes, sir. You and I park our shuttlecrafts in the same shuttle bay, directly or indirectly, and adding more every week. There are so many that even a cursory summary of the major ones is dizzying. What happened to the Romulan Empire? Also, what's with the mysticism? What happened to the Starfleet and the Federation? What happened to and why do we not see the rest of the TNG or Voyager crews? What did they make of what happened to Starfleet, Federation, and the Romulans? How did the Romulans, having just been through a nova which supposedly destroyed their empire, come to possess such a valuable thing as a Borg cube? Well, I won't say it. Wouldn't the Klingons, Cardassians, Federation, etc. have been run roughshod over a people unable to even rescue themselves? Well, you'd think. Where are the Cardassians and the Klingons? Where are they? Oh, and that corridor skating scene shudders. As others have said, each episode that passes adds yet more of these questions, large and small. The result is that the season's midpoint, episode 5 out of 10, we have a lot more questions than answers, or even the beginnings of an answer. This might be delicious to the cunning Romulan mind, but it's making this particular Terran's head hurt. But above and beyond all these issues, I feel there's a problem with the narrative arc of the series. The fact that the post-Nova galaxy and the Federation are in a much darker, less stable place, I could buy if there were a narrative arc in which that fall is explained, just like in this article I read. And the forces of good, which aim to return some sort of Roddenberry-topia, are introduced. After all, there's a fair amount of precedent for Starfleet and the Federation's ideals being hijacked and distorted into authoritarianism. This would be a great way of adapting Star Trek to our times. Having lost our moral compass, having lost social cohesion and stability, and indeed the very notion that there would be progress in the future, that tomorrow will be better than today, a notion which still resisted into the 1990s, how might we as individuals and as societies attempt to regain those lost heights? Well, what's really interesting is it doesn't seem like anybody wants to. Where's the Federation in all this? Even the Klingons. You know, the Klingons would not see any honor in, I know people have said in Star Trek Online, the Klingons ride roughshod over the Romulans. I get it all. But I don't even think, I mean, the Klingons are not heartless, and I don't think that they would want to see a once demoralized enemy. They wouldn't want to win because of a supernova. There's no honor in that. And I think, if anything, the Klingons would come in and help the Romulans to get them back on their feet so they could have their adversaries back and play that old game. Speaking of Hunt for Red October, we play our game with the Americans. Do we question our past utopia and imagine a different good for the future? If we do, what does that different future look like? What new challenges must we face, and what choices must we make to get there? If that were the basic structure of the series, then I would be willing to accept the problems you've flagged in the past, such as the apparent disdain for life or Picard's rudderlessness. In fact, we need to see what depths abandoning these original ideas plunges us into, both as a cautionary story and in order to understand what mighty effort will be demanded of our heroes to right this rudderless ship. A new Federation can be forged from such a fire, but we, the audience, need to be shown this. We need not to have this spelled out. Stay sweaty, and may the verisimilitude be with you. Klimt. Well, you know, you bring up another really interesting question. Where is the Federation in this show? I mean, as far as we've seen, they're only administrators back on Earth. Where's the Federation fleet? What are they doing? Has the Federation done anything? Why would the Federation allow the Alpha and Beta quadrants to be so destabilized? It's in no one's interests. You know, with the Romulan Star Empire losing its homeworld, you would think that all the powers that be would do whatever they can to not allow... Oh, the dogs are back, ladies and gentlemen. You know what that means? Why wouldn't they? I mean, it's yep, I know. I see Tallulah is barking. You know what that means, Tallulah? It means you're here just in time. But I don't know, Klimt. I don't understand. There's too many questions. Oh, listen up. Here, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Come on up. Come on. You want to come up? Come on. You want a cookie? You want to come and get it? Come up. You can say goodbye to everybody. Come on up. There you go. Okay, you stay. No, come on up. Gilbert, up. Come on. There you go. So, Gilbert, you're going to look into the camera. We're going to say goodbye to everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings me to an end of Robservations, episode number 345. And as all of you know, as I like to say, every person you meet has a story to tell that you have yet to hear. All you have to do is listen. Do you listen, Gilly? Do you? I know you don't listen at all. And all you have to do is listen. And I want to thank my moderating staff. I want to thank the Honorable Mayor Mike Bodden. I want to thank Detective Jim. I want to thank Greg Smith. I want to thank... Ooh, you guys are good. I want to thank Louis Yu and Jordy Lyons for being a great moderating staff. And I want to thank most of all you guys, you imagination connoisseurs, you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community, who make this show worth watching. Please send me letters. Please send me letters to the Burnettwork.net, and also any videos you want. I still will play anybody's videos. Nobody's been sending me videos, but if you want to send me videos rebutting me, I'll play them. You know, if you want to, you don't even have to write me a letter. Make me a video. I don't know. I'm hoping one day I want to get a video from Willow Yang. That's my hope. That's my dream, Ray Kinsella. That's my dream. But send me anything you want, and I love everybody for supporting the channel. Thank you so much. I very much appreciate that. Whether you're sending me super chats or tips, it's very nice. But letters are good too. Videos are good too. I really appreciate everybody who participates in the chats. It's pretty awesome. And if you like these chats, please, as Davey504 says, smash like now and subscribe and hit the little notification bell so you won't miss one of my chats. I will be back on the John Campea show tomorrow, and I will be back here in the afternoon talking about something. I also want to point out there is the Post-Geek Singularity Facebook page, which is moderated by people like The Richard. And go to Facebook if you still want to patronize Facebook. If you're still there, go to the Post-Geek Singularity Facebook page. It's a pretty great page. I'm active interacting with people there, and you can find me there too. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can always do that on Instagram and Twitter. So please do those things. And after that, I'd like to say, as always, ladies and gentlemen, have a better day. And I hope all of you have verisimilitude in your life.